idea of who's out in the audience. Basically, I'm going to close the polls down at this point and take a quick look at who we've got in the audience. But we've got a really good mix between management, operations, accounting. So, you know, we've got a broad range of what I'll call people to talk to today. So the nice thing is that we're going to cover topics that I think are important to all the different departments, but ultimately we all have different perspectives that we come into this. So you're going to challenge me today as an audience to go through and address all the different areas, but we'll go through and do that. So I'm going to go through and share my screen here. So let's turn around and got to close my poll so I can go through and basically hide that and get into my screen sharing, and we'll get started. So hopefully everybody can see the screen. The key thing that you may want to do is, if you are in the go-to meeting, up at the top there is a option to view it in full screen. It will allow you to see a much better view. Let's take a quick look as we move forward here on what our agenda is today. So we've got a couple minutes of PowerPoint. Ultimately, I want to give a quick introduction about who I am, SIS. More importantly, explain what is Compass for project management and why is it important to all of you today, spending some time with us. And we're really going to spend most of the time today in the presentation actually going through real business scenarios, looking at how the product and how SharePoint can help you as an organization. And then during this today, if you'll notice in your go-to meeting, you can actually ask questions. So if you ask questions of what we call the host and presenters and type your questions in, we'll be tracking those through the meeting here today so that we can answer some of those at the end. So please feel free either write them down, enter them in so that we've got a good idea of what your questions are. We'll try to answer as many as we can at the end of the time here. So my name again is Stephen Molka. I'm the SharePoint Practice Manager for SIS Software. Yes, that is me in the corner, looking a little bit older than I used to. But working 20 years with many of you out in the field in the construction industry, really we've focused as an organization, personally myself, on helping companies improve their business processes utilizing Microsoft technologies. And it's been a challenge. Technology changes every day, but the good thing is as you look at the benefits on spending time improving your business processes, making things more efficient, it is amazing what we can do nowadays if you look back from the fax machines and standing around during bid day to now email, and even more importantly as we move forward, you know, we're now moving into what we call the online experiences. So we did the poll. Thank you very much. We're going to move through that. A little bit about SIS Software. So we've been working with organizations for over 20 years. We're basically on the East Coast here of the United States, but also offices in Texas. And really, we've been focused on working in the construction industry with companies like yourself on what we call financial and operational software. To give you a little bit better idea of what that means, ultimately today we're talking about the Compass solution built on Microsoft SharePoint, but as an organization we also deal with financial solutions from Microsoft for construction called Dynamics, which are the SL and AX products. Many of you use Microsoft Project within the organization or have looked at or are looking at potentially CRM to help on your sales and bidding and your pipeline relationship. So we come to you as an organization, really a service organization, providing Microsoft solutions to help you improve the overall business functionality. So you're all muted at the moment. Again, we talked about the full screen, and we are recording this. I don't think you're going to all be saying much until the end, and we're going to address some questions, so I just wanted you to be aware of that. And again, we thank everybody for attending today. So I want to do a quick poll here on who is using SharePoint. It's going to give me a little bit of idea where to focus some of my conversation. So I'm going to open up the poll for a second, then we can turn around, let's get some answers, and then we'll move forward. So at this point, you should see the poll open. Let's get a couple votes in here. I've never seen a group vote so fast, so that's pretty good. 86% of you, almost 90% of you have voted, and we've got a large audience out there in less than 15 seconds, so thank you. So we got an interesting mix here, so that will be good. We'll talk about SharePoint. Many of you will see some things that are familiar, others may not, but ultimately you're going to see, in the end, really the business benefit of utilizing a collaborative solution. So I'm going to close the polls right now. You're going to be able to take a quick look at the results. So you should be seeing right now we've got about a 50-50 split between the two. So let's move forward and get back to our presentation. So I'm going to close the poll, basically come back to my screen sharing. You all at this point should see the screen, and let's continue moving forward. So what is Compass? Let's turn around, take a quick deep dive. But many of you that are using SharePoint have basically gone through and spent time building out libraries, building out functionality. SharePoint, I like to start with, is kind of like an Excel spreadsheet that's blank. You open it up and you can do almost anything with it. But from the beginning, you've got to go through and lay out your cells and your columns and your tables and your graphs. So SharePoint as a tool set from Microsoft is an excellent platform, but in many cases, when you look from a construction company, the base components, such as, I want to track drawings, I need to track submittals and RFIs, those components are not included with SharePoint out of the box. So with the Compass solution, what SIS has done over the last 10 years is basically pre-configured SharePoint and added extra solutions, which we call smart forms, to allow SharePoint and the power of SharePoint really to be able to be used across the construction industry easily. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with SharePoint, think of it as what I call a file server on steroids. So as you look, business has been done historically by saving files in a file server, and in many cases emailing those around and saying, could you approve this? Could you look at this? Would you send this out? Would you approve this? It's really an antiquated, but much better than we were 10 years ago, way of doing business, in the sense that email is very difficult to manage, managing files and hoping that they're on the file server and not on somebody's laptop and hoping that somebody didn't overwrite the last version, are all the things that we've seen in the past using a straight file server. As you move into Compass and more importantly the SharePoint environment, you're now in what we'll call a controlled environment that's centralized and allows everybody access, that really helps you organize things and move into what we'll call the next generation of technology. So what are the benefits of Compass? So as you look at things very quickly, you can standardize. Many organizations, you have Word, Excel, many different document types out there. And how do you manage standardizing this? A classic problem we ran into the other day at a customer. They had the Excel estimating spreadsheet, which we're going to talk about today, and they had different cost versions that they were trying to update across the company. They had about 50 estimators, and what they ended up having to do is send out the new cost Excel spreadsheet. Well, we all know what project managers and estimators do. They tend to go to the last project that they did and not use the current sheet, or where do you find the current sheet? So really, when you look at things such as standardizing your information, how it looks, or having a single place for the whole organization, bringing the field in to go, all of these things, once you get into Compass and more importantly the world of SharePoint and online collaboration, you now have a vehicle to look and to go through and to say, okay, now we've got a better way to manage our projects in our business. Now, many of you that have worked in SharePoint before, I want to focus for a second on what we call the benefit curve. I've seen historically as I walk into so many organizations, what are you doing with SharePoint? You're saving files after the fact. It's a document storage. And really, it's a very painful process for your employees, because what are they doing? They're creating information outside of the system, turning around and then having to save it in another location. So it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. So why, as we move up the benefit curve, why can't they be doing the documents right there within the systems that they're working in and managing the activity and routing information around instead of email, and ultimately everybody working in what we'll call the same world, which is the world of collaboration? So if you look at your functional curve, if you do work with SharePoint, please quickly rank yourself. What are you doing today? Are you storing documents, or are you doing the full world of collaboration? I think by the end of the day you'll have a better idea of what that means. One last thing I want to do or talk about before we get into the presentation itself here. So many of you may have heard what we'll call the AGC XML initiative. And ultimately, the product today is what we'll call AGC XML compliant. And it's really the next big thing in the construction industry. If you look at where things are going, we still have a tremendous difficulty in the fact that if I generate an RFI as a subcontractor and I send it up to my general contractor, I've got to send it via email, I've got to turn around, and I've got to enter it into their system, I've got to look at it, I've got to pass it around, and we don't have a lot of what we call collaboration going on. So the big problem that we get is ultimately, and I understand my screen is shared, so or not shared, so I'm sorry about that. You guys should see that. Thank you very much, Jim. Ultimately here then, the AGC XML, what it allows us to do is interop between the multiple systems. So as we go through here, what does that mean? We did a demonstration here at the AGC National Conference in February, but ultimately we were able to generate an RFI out of a disparate system, turn around, send that to the general contractor in the case that we did in this demonstration, to the construction manager, who then forwarded it to the general contractor, who forwarded it to the engineers, and then ultimately the specialty contractors. But these were different systems between all the different what we'll call software that was able to communicate. So instead of forcing you into what we'll call one system or one way of doing things, ultimately what we're trying to do as an industry, and I'm part of the AGC IT steering committee in the IT area, but ultimately trying to allow these systems from a standard, meaning the AGC XML, to be able to pass information. It's a very, very exciting initiative. And I think ultimately as we look at the cost today of what it takes to basically process what we'll call paperwork, right? What's it cost to process an RFI? What's it cost to process a change order, submittal? It's a huge cost. That's really what we'll call non-value added. We've got to have the paperwork, but the cost of creating the RFI, sending the RFI, answering the RFI, filing the RFI is going to be huge in the construction industry. Much like EDI and everything else, the RFI is doing in the area that we've seen in distribution. So let's go through here. We've spent enough time in PowerPoint. Appreciate it. We're going to get out of PowerPoint at this point. Let's get into the demonstration. I've got to switch screens here for a second, so hold. I'm now at what I'll call the home page. So the home page in all of this, we're looking at the starting place. That we've got to come in. If you think of this much like a website, in the sense that many of you are familiar with CNN, Fox News, whatever is your favorite, you've got a starting place, and then ultimately you're branching out to lower or different sections. So think of this layout in many cases as the same layout, where we've got the home site, we've got navigation to different departments that we're looking at. We also have what we call the top address or the top bar navigation, but we can jump around very quickly and say, okay, I want to move into another department, or I want to go into accounting. If they did accounting today, we're talking a lot about operations, but ultimately in most configurations that we do for customers, you're setting up really a corporate intranet, which allows not only the project execution to be up in this collaborative environment, but also all the other departments and tracking information. So these benefits go beyond just what we call project and project management. So the heart of where we're going to be today is in what we'll call operations. Many of you may call it construction, whatever else, but right now we're in what I call the projects department, the operations department, depends on how you want to call it. We have some larger organizations that are out there, and when we've gotten into those, you may have multiple companies, you may have multiple divisions. All of that can be set up according to how your organizational structure is laid out. Now, I'm looking at right now what we call the project board. Now, what's important about the project board? If you look at the execution of a project in its life cycle, from estimate to what we'll call closeout, the big thing is looking and saying, okay, how am I tracking all of this business and how am I organizing? So historically, we've had what we'll call the P drive or the projects drive up on the file server, and then we've had loosely or tightly created subfolders to store documents in there. So this is the same analogy, but we've got a lot more power here. Let's talk about what power we have and what benefits that's going to provide to us. So if we look at the project board, again, as soon as we're going to start in this demonstration, kind of go from what I call estimating to closeout very quickly. But if I go through and I've got a new project to estimate, I can basically click on a new item. And what that's going to do is allow us to log what typically is called a project information sheet or project information whatever. A lot of you are passing along Excel sheets once you win a job or when you start to estimate it. So think of it this way, that you're going to fill in what the job is. You're going to fill in, again, all the specialty things you want to track, whether it's bonded job, certified payroll, where is the job, when do we think it's going to start, and then ultimately hit the save button. So for time today, I'm not going to do a lot of what I'll call typing, but ultimately what ends up happening is that project entry that you put in goes through and then creates what we call a project workspace. We're going to talk about that in a couple more minutes because the project board allows us to organize the complete body of work that we're going after or that we are executing, and then ultimately the project workspace is drilling down into one particular project that we're either bidding or currently executing. Now, the nice thing is when you look at this, and many people say, well, I'm working with thousands of projects, a year, so how am I going to organize all this information? The whole system's geared towards what we call a role center or a role focus. So if I turn around and I'm in the estimating department, I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to click on the left-hand side. This is what I call my quick. And I've then filtered that particular list to those projects that are just in the job status of bidding. So in this case, you could turn around and again, from a filter standpoint, we could say, I would like to look at those projects that I am just the estimator on in my particular branch, or if I'm a VP in my particular region, however you want to do that. So using what we'll call the views, you're able to slice and dice information again according to what role you are in the organization. So examples would be bidding projects, the active projects. You may want to look at things by state, by division, and then we can expand on those. And we can say, okay, in Georgia we've got 2 that we're bidding on, one that's in the execution phase. Again, depending on where you are in the role, very quickly you can look at this. Now, in many cases, and for customers that we have that are in the Microsoft Dynamics suite of solutions, the entry of the project board once you get to the project phase of execution, and again, these are user-defined in terms of how you want to define it, but you can turn around and ultimately then it will create what we call the project header into the system. Okay, so I'm hearing that my microphone is not that good. So what I think I'm going to do right here is I'm going to disconnect for 1 second and then come back in and see if that does help. I apologize on that. Okay, I'm back on. I was not able to get on a telephone right now. It'll take a couple minutes to do that, but hopefully this is a little bit better in the sound quality that we have coming through. And if it isn't, then I'm sure I'll have a couple people step into my office. Now, let's flip around then, and let's turn around, and we've gone back to what we'll call the project board. And ultimately what I want to drill into on active projects is I want to jump into what we'll call the project workspace. So here is what we'll call the project workspace. Now, many of you that are using SharePoint today, I think you'll be very familiar with this scenario where if you've organized your business around a project, then you've got to call IT and they've got to create this workspace and they've got to set everything up. The whole concept of the project board is that when somebody enters it, it automatically goes through and creates the project workspace. It sets the email log and it brings a bunch of information back down. So what we've done then is we've kind of removed what we'll call the hurdles in IT having to go through and create a workspace, because many companies that I've seen that have done this type of analogy of creating what we'll call project workspaces to execute a project, they're waiting days and days to get their projects and their workspace set up. Here, entering it into the project board, it turns around and quickly sets up the project workspace. So what are we looking at? So from a navigation standpoint, I started at what we'll call the home site. I've moved in from the projects department and I'm now in one particular project. So this project is, it's a module of examples, which means it's got general contractor, it's got specialty contractor built in, but ultimately what we're doing in the general sense is we're working on the Atlanta Stadium. I don't know how many of you have seen that picture. This is a new picture coming up of what it's going to look like. It's state-of-the-art, so I'm excited when it does get built. Hopefully the Falcons will do a little bit better in the future. But ultimately, right now, we're working on, and we're, as a specialty contractor, and I'll bounce between a little bit specialty in general, but we're working on a fire protection installation within this system. So a couple things as I look from my navigation, notice on my left-hand side, my quick launch has changed. I now group things by what we'll call business process. So I've got my estimating grouping of things that I'm going to be tracking. I'm managing my drawings related to the project, whether I'm a design build or just a bid type company. And then ultimately all your project management activities related to RFIs, meeting minutes, some contracts, email log, and so on and so forth. So in many cases, as we work with organizations, each of you are tracking different types of things. So all of this information, when you look at it, is very configurable to how your company works and really how much information do you need to track. But let's drill through a couple things, right? When we come into the home page, what are we really trying to get a handle on? So we've got to look from our RFI activity, our submittal activity, our overdue tasks, and potentially our overdue issues. So immediately, the project manager, the project team has an idea of what is going on. So we can look at what action do we need to take. where are things that need attention. If I turn around here from my RFI perspective, I can look at those items that have been submitted or basically gone through. A couple days old, you guys have never seen this, right? Where as we've submitted things, we need answers on. So this is my RFI log. It's also my RFI itself, my library that's tracking all my RFI activity. But very quickly from what I call the drill down from the dashboard, we can get in and basically jump into the RFI section itself. So we're going to come back and spend some more time in there, but what I want to do right now is turn around and what happens in the first thing when we go through and get a job. Ultimately, we've got to download or basically get some of what we call a bid package. So we've got to get our drawings, our specs, and everything else, or we may want to put the bid package out for a particular bid. But the key functionality is we look at some things here, and I think as many of you that have worked in SharePoint, you're going to see one of the areas that we've addressed that's huge frustration, which is how do we organize all of our drawings, our bid information, and really make it easy for project managers, project engineers to work with. So the key thing is, what are we going to do here when we get started? So if you think about the old days and how work used to happen, basically in the bid package, stuff used to come into the mailroom, turned around, and then somebody would get it all assembled and then hand it out to the project manager. So we've taken what we call the same concepts and then automated that. So bear with me for 1 second. It's been an interesting morning. So I'm actually connecting to an outside server in a data center. We've had some connection issues here. This will bounce back in a second, but once in a while we may see that we lose a connection back to my server. And now we're back. So let's go in, let's enter in what we call a new bid package. So I'm going to get another addendum. We're not going to worry about my spelling today. So this is going to be addendum number 2 that came in. We could go through, what type of discipline that it came in. Let's say this was the architectural area. The revision package, right? I want to turn around and actually specify what am I getting in. This is addendum number 2. It may be for a particular item. Let's just say item 1, change order, whatever was related. And then, the type of documents that we have. It could be just straight drawings. It could be drawings and specifications, and then particular notes. So what we are doing in this is a note. Ultimately, we're logging and saying, okay, we just received from our customer, or we downloaded a bunch of information. So we've just logged that, addendum number 2. And this is a log then of every time those items came in on the bid package or we went out and got them. Now, the nice thing about this, to make it very easy for our users to be able to classify and get all the documents, is the concept of what we'll call the drop zone. So notice that once I've logged the item, the drop zone is lit up, and I can turn around and I can go through and I can FTP, download those from FTP. I can take them off a CD, whatever we want to do. So I have some demo data here on the side that I'm going to go through and basically use and work with. So I've got a couple of addendums. I'm going to grab 3 of these PDF files that came in. I can drag and drop them out of email. Then I'm going to turn around and basically do my drag and drop. That right now is loading in the background. And then once we are done and it's loaded up the files into what we'll call the bid docs, we've categorized all of those with the information that's come in. So 3 files have been loaded successfully. That's good. I could turn around and right quickly here, I could view those uploaded documents. So I'm going to click on that button right there. And then this is taking me to what we call the bid package docs. So notice these 2 libraries, the bid package log and the bid package doc, work in conjunction. Now, the key thing as we look at this, what has just happened, instead of the users having to load every one of these files and then add the associated metadata or additional information we're trying to track, just by them logging that the first time, automatically that information when they brought it through came in and showed them or tagged the additional metadata. So if I get rid of, because we're filtering this right now, but if I look at this by what we'll call revision package, what do we see? We see our original 7 that we downloaded. We've got our first addendum that came in, and then on the flip side, we've got this second addendum, those 3 files that I just brought in. So this very quickly allows us to turn around and ultimately bring this information in and very quickly to identify and log this. And one of the biggest problems that we've always seen, you guys have seen working with drawings and specifications or anything else, is how do you manage those? We're going to talk about some things when we get down into the drawing logs, which the same functionality exists, right? This is the bid package. We've downloaded those. when we're managing drawings. We've got the drawing log and then also the drawing library itself. So it really speeds up that whole functionality going through and managing all the drawings and activity that's happening with it. So let's move forward here. Let's talk real quick, about estimating, right? So we've downloaded some things, we're doing our takeoffs, we're doing our bidding, whatever else needs to be done, but the big thing is let's deal with trying to get an estimate out. Now, depending on your estimating system, you may turn around and you may have a lot of different ways that estimating is done. So on the flip side, what we call Excel is still the #1 estimate tool out there. I'm going to show an example for those of you that do use Excel and Word for various items, how utilizing in SharePoint you can basically, again, standardize files, standardize activity, and standardize business processes. So in the estimating docs, we're going to try to produce an estimate, right? Ultimately in here, you'll notice we've got a bunch of estimates, starting from an original estimate that we were working on through change orders, and then we have supporting files or reference files. So if I turn around here very quickly, utilizing SharePoint, what we call site content, we can take, in many cases, what we call standard template information that you have and embed that into what we'll call the library. So what you're going to see is now all of a sudden I've got a standard, what we'll call large mechanical budget worksheet. Very familiar, I'm sure, those of you that still are estimating with Excel and how that you're doing things. But a couple differences that I want to point out real quick here. Ultimately, we've lit up now what we'll call the document information panel. And what that allows us to do is, as we work on our Excel spreadsheets, we can turn around and we can further classify this. So let's say that this was an original estimate we were working on. Ultimately, it's an estimate versus a takeoff, and it's for $15,000 or $25,000, 152, and then I'm going to hit the save button. And the key thing about this is that, #1, it saves right back to where we started. So the problem where you had in the past of people opening files and saving them in other locations or utilizing an old type of an old file are no longer there. So if I turn around here, and I'm just going to call this demo estimate, that's saving, and again, we're not worried about my spelling today, but it's saving right back into the project that I started in, 9955 fire protection, and at that point, we've saved it. And this is one example, and I could spend a couple minutes in here, but we do have versioning control turned on, so as an estimator, I can actually check that in, and I check it out when I'm working on it, so only one person can work on it at one time. So this is the start. Then I'm going to turn around here as I move forward. There's version control on. Next time I open it up, it will basically track, in fact, okay, I've opened it again. I've saved all the different versions. I can revert back to older versions. So that works very, very well in terms of trying to better manage files than what you see today. So that's just an example. It was SharePoint, what we call site content, but more importantly, we've organized things around document types. We've organized around document class so that these files are much better organized. So we've got the bid. We've got our estimate together. Ultimately, we could put out a proposal. No problem. Now, we've won the job, right? What's the first thing that we're going to end up doing then? We're going to jump up and down and have a party. Yes, that's a great thing. But ultimately, let's have our kickoff meeting. So now we're going to move into what we call the meeting minutes. So many of you have meeting minutes. How formal they are may be another question. But with the meeting minutes, we can turn around in here. And this is what we call an example of the web smart forms. So in here, as soon as we've opened up the meeting or started a new meeting, it understands what project we're working in. We've got all the standard, what we call information and tracking a meeting minutes. But the key thing that we're looking at now is we have what we call meeting items, things that we're working on or would like to talk about. So think about them as topics, right? In this particular example, I have 2 topics, which is I want to talk about the estimate and the budget, and I also want to view the construction drawings. Now, what happens at every meeting, right? Meetings generate tasks and to-dos, and people are supposed to do things. So the key thing is how do you really create a business process to keep all of this organized? So if I look here, right, on my review estimate and budget, I can come in, the 3 dots I clicked on the right-hand side, open up another task pane, which now I'm looking at the details on what's going to happen on this particular meeting item. If I turn around and I can add additional comments, because meetings have a life of their own, right? As we look at the minutes, things are open and closed. So at this point, we had more conversation. It's then time stamping and adding things in here, so I have a history of what was done, what was talked about. But ultimately down here, I also have tasks that I can task people with. So if I look at what is happening on this particular one, I need a budget changed, or I can go in and add a new task. So let's flip around here. Let's give a quick example. New task, or let's talk about permitting, right? And actually, we're talking about reviewing the estimate. So change estimate, or let's change number of sprinklers. Okay, and when would we like to start this? Well, it's going to start today. I think we need this done towards the end of next week, and then ultimately I want to assign it to somebody. So I'm operating as a user called demo user today, so I'm going to assign it to Mr. Demo User. The nice thing about this is I can add an additional description on what they're supposed to do. You should do this. And the key thing about when I'm done here and I hit the close button is that ultimately what this is going to end up doing is creating a task in what we'll call our master task list. So in a second here, I'm going to basically get what I'll call an Outlook notification. But the big thing is I look at all of this. What's going to happen is ultimately then I'm going to get not only a notification, but in my task list, I've got a master task list of all the items that I'm working on and are being managed. So let's go take a look at that for a second. So I could go back to the home page. You would saw that. I also have project tasks here on the left-hand side from a quick navigation. And then notice from a phase, automatically this wrote into what we call the project task list. Now, this is organized, and we're finding nowadays, obviously, with what we call graphics and things like that, that people are much more ease of navigation. But the organization, if you look at things, most companies that we work with, you have a standard, what we call, list of things that should be done in the life of a project. So many of you call these phases different phases. These are some standard things that we've seen over the years. But whether you're in the bidding phase or closeout, whatever else, the idea is that very quickly you can go through and say, okay, I just want to look at those items by clicking on the design that are in the particular design phase. Or I want to look at those things that are in the pre-design. Or I want to look at all different active tasks so that I can, by a view, slice and dice all these particular items. Now, this one just came in here. Ultimately, the email will go out and notify the person. But if you look at setting up a standard task list that you can go through, then as the project manager starts the project, they can assign the particular task, they can add new tasks, meeting minutes and issues feed the task list, and then all of a sudden we've now got a single, what we'll call, accountability of what items need to be done and then tracking what is happening through completion. Again, tying meeting minutes and all those components together so that we're using a business process and streamlining the overall operations. So we've done the meeting minutes. Again, what we call the smart forms. Why is it a smart form? Because ultimately it goes through and has a lot of intelligence to make life and the business process easier. Now, let's move into submittals. We talked about RFIs. We were going to do basically an RFI to start during what we'll call the estimating process. We jumped into submittals earlier on as we went through the dashboard, but typically whether it's during the estimating phase or whether it's during the execution phase, you know, we've got our RFIs and submittals. So let's jump back into what we call the RFI for a second here. And what I want to talk about is a few things on activity routing and then working more importantly with all the business partners that you have out there. So what do we have? This is your RFI log, basically tracking all the information. All of you are familiar with RFI logs, those type of things. Ultimately, when I want to look at a particular RFI, but for this case, I can click on this and open it up, but I want to start a new RFI and then talk about functionality. Now, all the smart forms work in conjunction and work the same. So once we get familiar with the look and feel of all this, when we jump into submittals, you saw it in meeting minutes, you become very quick on how the layout is and how the operations is. So we talked when we start a new request for information or any smart form, it understands what project that we're in, it understands who started this. If I wanted to go through and actually start with a spec section, bring additional information, I can start typing in what we call the auto-suggest, and immediately this is a what we call user-defined field that a project manager or an overall company could define, or we could just type something in here if we wanted to go through and say that we were dealing with basically glass or sprinklers or whatever area. So it knew that this was an RFI. Ultimately, it was originating from myself, and again, these are all pretty standard RFI sections, so instead of spending a lot of time filling information out, I'm going to highlight some of the key other areas. So the subject is, let's just call it specifications. Classic problem, we don't get enough information. We'd like a clarification. The question is, what is that? Typical, they didn't give us what we needed, and so on and so forth. Now, when I turn around here, the first thing I'm going to do is hit save. And then it's telling me right now we want to have a requested reply date. So we're going to set that date so that we can be tracking how old things are. That's a required field. I'm going to hit the save button again, and then that's going to assign at that point in time an RFI number. So if I come back up to the top, we now are in RFI 1056, and we have started the process of what we call activity routing. Now, activity routing is a really key thing, and it can be as sophisticated or as simple as an organization wants. But over the years, what we had found is if you look at most organizations, people are moving information through steps, which means I'm emailing it in the simplest sense to myself, to my boss, to an estimator, to somebody to review, and these documents move all around through the business. If you look at an RFI in some companies where you have, let's say, a professional engineer or somebody starting an RFI, then ultimately a project manager should look at those. Maybe a vice president should look at those, and then it should go to the customer. So the challenge we had many years ago is customers wanted the control to be able to say, I have an activity, I have an RFI, I have a submittal, and I'd like to walk that through what we'll call a bunch of steps. So what I'm looking at right here is, as a user, meaning a company, I have defined 4 particular steps that I would like an RFI to go through. We could have as many activities for an RFI that we would like, simple RFI, complex RFI, so on and so forth, internal RFI, external RFI. But ultimately the 4 steps is it's going to start with an originator. In this case, it's going to go to a project manager. The customer is the next person in line, and then a project engineer will look at what the customer's response is. Seems pretty simple, right? Which it is. The key thing about this is instead of creating, those of you that are using SharePoint, complex workflows and going back to IT, all this is built in where all a user has to do is create the activity type, and then based on what they would like it to do, move forward or move backwards, automatically all the workflow and everything is done in the background very easily. So let's look at what does that really mean. In the RFI itself here, the conditions initiated, because I've just started it, and as the originator in this particular activity, the only thing that I can do, because I've defined it that way, is approve it. I want to move it forward. And in many cases, I want to put some notes in here that says this is a problem, and so on and so forth. And notes are required. We have that switch turned on right now. Okay, my spelling is horrible today. We won't worry about even spell check. Now, as soon as I hit save on this, what's going to happen? As the originator, I would be done with it. It would close, and then basically it would move to what we'll call the next step. So as we look at what's going to happen is 2 things. The condition is going to change to unsubmitted because the next person in our activity was the project manager. So we're tracking the condition and we're tracking the ball in court. And we're not only doing this for RFIs, but we're doing this for submittals, or we're doing it for every document or any type of document that you would like in the whole business. And this really has been a huge benefit to so many companies that are coming through and trying to get a handle on business processes where documents are flying wildly around the organization. Now, you'll notice here down in my routing steps, where are we right now? We're basically at the project manager. What can the project manager do? He can approve it, which would move to the next step, would be the customer. He could say revise and resubmit, which would go back to the originator, or he can void it and stop the whole process. So going through, let's approve this right now. We've got to add a couple more notes in here. We're tracking all the dates. Notice that when Stephen Mocha approved this and everything else. I then go through, basically hit save again, and now I've moved it to the next step. If I hit refresh on my screen, you'll see that the conditions changed to submitted, and then the ball in court is ultimately the customer. Now, the example I'm showing today, because I didn't pick a particular originator that I want to send this to, is where you'd have your business partners working within the system versus they may be out of the system. So you've got your choices, which means you can bring in, the architects, the owners, or all those, or you can keep them separate, or if you're a specialty contractor, basically feed that information back into what we'll call potentially a general or a CM system. Now, the hardest thing about all this when we look at stuff has been ultimately to generate and to get this output flowing around. So if we look here, we've got the output button. And if I say email RFI, what's going to happen? Ultimately, what it's going to do is it's basically going to open up my email. It's going to package the RFI as a cover sheet. Any attachments that I would have referenced into that particular item would also be in that particular email. And then notice how, again, working with all the Microsoft tool sets, I've got standard email, I can send the information out and move forward, but we've just immediately encapsulated everything that we had in the RFI into a PDF file. We've got our routing in here if we want to show what steps it's gone through, and then any attachments that we may have associated with this particular document. Makes it very, very simple to get the information out moving forward. For this case, I'm going to send it to Mr. Jim Hayes. He's one of my cohorts in the field, or my customer. And then I'm going to turn around and I want to copy the project too, which is my 9955 project, so that I have that all logged in the email log. We'll take a look at that in a minute. And then it's a standard email. I can be typing anything that I wanted to add into there, and then basically hit send. But that is how easy it is, whether we're sitting in a submittal, an RFI, to really move output around and get it out to those people we're trying to address information to. And you can see my little delay here. So my servers aren't running as good as they should. I apologize. So very quickly here, and again, we want to highlight we've got the drop zone, so we could turn around and drag and drop files in here. That would then be part of the file references. Or we could just turn around and basically add an item, and we may have something that's out on a customer site or an FTP site that we just want to link to, and we can really literally just right mouse click and paste the URL into there. Very simple to do in tracking all the information in one place. So we've gone through the RFI side of things. Now let's flip around and get into the submittal side. And again, now that we've gone through some of this, you're going to start to see all the basic functionality and all the basic, what we'll call look and feel, repeating, so it's very easy for the user community to turn around and to basically, from a training aspect and a what we'll call adoption standpoint, pick up on the solution. So now we're in our submittal library. It looks very much like the RFI library. I've got different views, so I can turn around and look at what we'll call our submittal log. Ultimately, some of the key things, I've got X amount of these approved. Some of them have gone through the complete cycle and been completed. I've got some that are submitted, waiting responses, and some unsubmitted. So as a project manager, what do I need to be working on? Basically my unsubmitted items. So if I turn around here and basically open up one of the RFIs that I've, the submittals that I have, this one is in an unsubmitted state right now. Notice that I've got my submittal package that's associated with this particular submittal. And we're going to talk about in a minute how we get that submittal package together. And then right now, as I move forward back to what we call our activity routing, I've got where it started from the originator. It's sitting in the project manager's hand. So if I turn around and edit this particular item, I can basically look at the item. I could triple click here, and this is a set of drawings. So what's going to happen is it's ultimately opening up the submittal package that I want to work with. Allows me to look at it very quickly, make some connotations, do what I need to do with it. As a PM, or ultimately even a customer, then I can turn around and basically come back in and I can say, okay, that looks pretty good. So at this point in time, I'm going to basically submit this. The next step in the submittal process is the customer. Put some notes on here if I'd like to in the submittal process itself. Basically save that. Our condition will change to submitted, and then the ball in court will be the customer. Now, let's look at a couple things here, right? So we came out of what we'll call the RFC drawings. That's where this particular bid package came, or release for construction. And this was the fire protection complete set. Now, we were kind of looking at a few things, and if I hit refresh, basically our unsubmitted is going to change, and we're going to be up into the submitted items. So now notice we only have one. That's all changed now, and we are now in the submitted phase. But I want to show how easy it is to basically submit if we want to talk about things for approval through the submittal process. So that had come from the release for construction drawings. And you'll notice right here, as we look at these drawings, that could be shop drawings, release for construction, design drawings, specifications, again, whatever example makes sense to you. But ultimately here, notice that not only did the submittal track where we are in the process, but this particular package that I'm submitting, the condition and the ball and cork changes automatically as the submittal goes through its business process. So if you look at any library, we went back to estimating, because in estimating docs, we also had what we'll call a way to go through, and internally on all estimates, we wanted to have the vice president or a regional manager approve the estimate. So notice that the ball and cork and the condition are changing on these documents if we choose to route those through the activity routing engine. If I turn around here and come back to the RFC, I want to show you how easy it is to go through and basically to submit those into a submittal or to start a submittal process. So here I've got a drawing. Just for some navigation, if I click on that, as some of you may be wondering, where is the drawing? I'm opening up that particular drawing. Those are drawings we may have loaded in via the drawing log. We may have also just copied those into a release for construction library. We have multiple options. But if I click on the three dots, and that's the new metaphor that you're going to see now in what we'll call the Office 2013 family of products, the Office products in the SharePoint 2013, but it allows us to basically access additional information. And then in here, we've got what we call Add to Submittal. So if I click on the Add to Submittal, it's going to take that particular drawing package. It now adds it into the submittal. Much like the RFI, I can turn around and I can then say, what type of activity would I like this to go through? And I started to type just SU, and it's doing what we call the auto suggest, which says, okay, submittal is an option for you. And we could put in the subject. We could fill in basically a spec section if we want. We could carbon copy people. We could tell them what type of action to take, and then basically hit save. As soon as I'm hitting save, this is then created submittal 582. We saw before, much like the RFI, where we could turn around and we could email that submittal. Or on the flip side, what's going to happen if I come back over to my email? Notice that we've been getting a lot of alerts that have been coming through here. So let's look at what has been happening in here. Now, let's look at, for instance, where we have the action required on the specifications. So if I open up that particular email, what has happened, if you remember when we did the RFI activity, basically it had an action that was required. The project manager, right, we assigned it to him, and he was supposed to go through and basically review or approve this. And the current condition was unsubmitted. So notice what happened as we moved through each activity step, or each step in the activity, there was notifications that were going out. So if you have your business partners within the solution, obviously you don't have to address it to somebody because you can set up your activity steps that this is going to go over to the customer, and these are a group or the members of individuals that make up the customer approvers, or you can turn around and assign it to somebody and email the document back out. The nice thing about the action required and all the notification emails is very quickly within here I can click on that and go right back into the document set that I need to take action on. So the whole goal in all of this is to make what we'll call navigation, ease of use, moving to the next thing that you're supposed to do very easy. And we're back in the RFI that we were looking at it earlier. And then now at this point, and there were other emails in there, if I was in the customer chain, the customer would have got a notification that he also had to take action on this. So many different things happening here. We also had, as we went through, notice specifications. We've got a submittal activity that's been assigned to a customer. Now, for my demo, right, I'm acting as what we'll call project engineer, project manager, vice president, and also customer. So at this point in time, you can see right now that submittal we were working on, was assigned to the customer, which was me, and ultimately requires some action. It tells us what the previous notes were, what we need to do on this, and we're at the step of a customer response that they could very quickly link into, or you could send that PDF package out just via normal email. So we've kind of rounded out the whole area in terms of we've got our submittals, we've got our RFIs, we're executing through in the project. Let's come back into our project workspace. I'm going to come back to the home site. We've got to watch my time here a little bit. There's so many things we've got to get covered. And then ultimately what we want to do is finish up on a couple things, such as what other type of libraries and functions are normally organizations finding a benefit. Now, what we did earlier, right, email is a problem within all organizations because it can't be managed. There's so many different things that are happening with it. But when I went through here, and I'm going to open up my email log, notice earlier today I had carbon copied, right, the project, so the 9955 project with that particular RFI that we sent out. So in our email log, we're capturing all the emails related to a particular project. I can organize these by a subject. I can organize who was sending them to. I can organize by the sender. And then ultimately now I've got a history now of all the different emails and activity that have happened. So it really helps bring the email activity, what we'll call, all together. Now there's another big key on this that we haven't touched on, which is called the project address book. So when you're working on a particular project, you've got a lot of companies, you've got a lot of contacts, and ultimately how do you keep all this stuff organized, and really how do you share that with a project team. So now we're in what we'll call the project address book. And really, as you set up a project in many cases, it's the first thing that you're going to do is go up to what we call the global address book, select the different players that are going to be on your project, and then ultimately bring them into the project address book. But in here, as I look, notice I can, from a search perspective, and this is a very global search, I can turn around and say, you know what, I want to go find, somebody that's a vendor. So VE, I started typing. It's going to start finding any instances with VE in it or vendor. The nice thing about this is it's not what we'll call starting or first character search. If I knew something about a particular individual, like ULK, I could find it. Or for that matter, if I knew something about his phone number. So any value that's within or captured within a company and a contact, I can search on very quickly and find something. So I come back into SIS. That's the company that we want to work with and add some more people. Notice I have the mouse over information here to understand who they are. They're a subcontractor that specializes in structures. And for many organizations, you want to very quickly add additional users in here. So if I click on the user, I can turn around and add another user. So let's say I'm going to add in here Mr. Scott. My spelling is horrible today. And let's say I've got my brother working. So it understands Scott Molka. It's got them all filled in here. All I've basically got to do is put in his address information. And at that point in time, it brought over all the company information, hit the save button. I've just added him in as an additional contact. So very quickly then, it allows a user to go through and to add that information into the overall project address book or the global address book. Now, the key thing is, why is that important or how it helps? Because obviously when you're working with smartphones, right, you're selecting the attendees that we're working with or at a particular meeting. If you're sending an RFI or a submittal out, you've got a master address book that you can interact with. But in many cases also where you're in email itself, where you may want to turn around and say, okay, I want to send a new email. And instead of everybody having their own personal contact list, I can turn around and say to, and then turn around and I may want to select from a particular project address book or the overall global address book, and then I can find an individual very quickly and basically select them and move forward. So it allows us to bring all the email, bring the project address book all together, use all the Microsoft tool sets that people are very familiar with. Now, we are about 5:54. I've got roughly about 4.5 to 5 minutes here. I want to leave a couple minutes also for questions in the end. So let me go through here. There's one other item that I want to touch on as we talk about just overall summary and navigation and setup and configuration. as you look at things, right, we talk about the different libraries, and there's many, many libraries that I haven't even touched on in here, but I wanted to give you a flavor of many of the key functionalities that we find when executing a project. But from a configuration standpoint, for those companies that need what we'll call systems configured to their business processes, the libraries are very configurable. They're very set up to your business processes, because in the end, ultimately, as we look at how do you improve a business, the software has to fit your business processes, not you turning around and having to fit the software. So we're going to do a couple summary things here in PowerPoint. Then we're going to get into some question sections, hopefully, and I haven't been overlooking at the questions. We've got some questions coming in, so that would be good. If you have some questions, please get those typed in, and let's talk about, number one, how do we learn some more, and ultimately where are things going on this. So hopefully that gave you a great flavor overall on capabilities of Compass, which is really the extensions on top of SharePoint. Many of all the items that I focused on today, for those of you that have SharePoint will notice that those are not standard out of the box. Those are special add-ins that we've done to go through and basically make life more efficient. Those of you that are not in SharePoint, I think you can see overall Compass just providing a huge business benefit to organize files, to organize business processes better. And then the question becomes, okay, if we want to learn more, what do we need to do and what can we do? So a couple quick things. We typically work with organizations, right? We want to kind of look at, what areas are you trying to improve the business? Where and what structure do you have? Many companies today that we work with have a SharePoint infrastructure in some sense. They would like to improve that. We can come in and help or plug in our components to improve that. Other companies may turn around and they may not have a SharePoint set up today where we can go through and help bring those things and get that set up for you. And then ultimately, if you're even looking at new financial and operational software, as an organization, we'd love to work with you on those items. So many different things. But the first thing we do is normally our team will come in and really try to get a handle on where you're going, what problems you're trying to solve, and then work with you on saying, okay, this is what that would work like or look like as a project. So we're going to get into the question area right now, and what I want to do, I'm going to put up some contact information here. So obviously there was many things that we didn't cover today. You may have many questions I may not be able to address altogether. Ultimately, please do send us an email. Reach out on the phone. Debbie Peavy has been communicating with many of you via email. She would be happy to take any questions and get some answers moving forward. And then if I can get my question section opened up here a little bit more, then I'll be able to see some of these questions that are coming through. Okay. I'm having a real hard time in the questions in my go-to meeting. I cannot see all the different particular questions. Let me see if I can make that a little bit bigger. What? I can't see it. Right here. Ah. Okay, I was able to go through here and get my questions open. So one question that came in are these applications, are these apps? So as you look at the new 2013 model, which is a SharePoint app concept, those aren't applications, or they're not apps in the true sense of the SharePoint 2013 app. Those are basically what we'll call different components of SharePoint that can be added in that we have created, but not under what we call the application world. Let's see what other questions I have in here. Can you import contacts into Outlook from the global address book? That is definitely yes. No problem there. You can actually cut, copy, and paste. And another thing is, could it be a distribution list within Outlook? It is embedded into Outlook, so you definitely could use it as a distribution list. And then there was a question here about how does a new, what we'll call project workspace get organized, or how does a project workspace actually get created? So if you think about what happens today for many of you that are having IT create that project workspace, you've got to turn around and create off of some template a project workspace or a subweb that has whatever template